May 14, 2012. A man steps out of his car in a quiet Quebec suburb. There's a cardboard box in his trunk. Inside, $1 million in $20 bills. He's made this handoff 100 times. But today, the house he's walking toward hides 12 federal agents. The moment he opens the box, flashbang grenades detonate. Officers swarm from every entrance. Face shoved into dirt, wrists zip-tied, he hears the charges. Counterfeiting at industrial scale. A Secret Service agent leans in. 60 years. You'll die in Supermax. But what they don't know yet is that he will never face prison. This man printed more counterfeit US dollars than anyone in recorded history. And in 18 months, he'll walk out of court with a $1,300 fine. How did he turn handcuffs into leverage? And what secret forced Washington to let him go? November 2008. Frank Barassa sits on a cluttered desk in a rented apartment outside Montreal, a magnifying loupe pressed to his eye. Pinned beneath the glass sits a worn $20 bill. He's examined this note for 47 consecutive days. He knows the placement of every micro-printed word along Andrew Jackson's collar. He's memorized the exact green to copper color shift on the numeral in the lower right corner. He's measured the security thread's position to the millimeter, 1.2 inches from the left edge, embedded between the second and third printing layers. Frank isn't a master engraver or a chemistry PhD. He's a high school dropout from Trois-Rivières who made his first real money selling stolen car parts and low-grade marijuana. But he possesses two qualities that separate successful criminals from the ones who get caught: obsessive patience and the ability to identify the single point of failure everyone else overlooks. Every counterfeiter who's ever tried to fake American currency has failed for the same reason. Not the ink, the printing, or the holograms. It's the paper. You can't buy it or make it. Because US currency isn't paper at all, it's fabric. 75% cotton and 25% linen, manufactured by exactly one company on Earth. Crane Currency in Dalton, Massachusetts. They've held the contract since 1879. The formula is classified. The facility is guarded by federal agents. Every sheet is tracked from production to printing. If you don't have this paper, you have nothing. Your fakes will feel wrong before they look wrong. Every cashier in America will catch them by touch alone. So Frank asks a different question. What if he didn't try to replicate the paper? What if he convinced a legitimate manufacturer to produce it for him? The plan sounds insane, but Frank has done his research. Currency-grade cotton linen stock isn't exclusively American. Central banks worldwide use similar material, and dozens of specialty mills produce it legally for government contracts. If he could pose as a corporate buyer with a plausible cover story, he might social engineer his way to the one ingredient that makes counterfeiting impossible. He spends December and January cold-calling paper mills across Europe under a fabricated identity. Jackson Maxwell, procurement director for Keystone Investments Limited. The pitch is simple. His firm is issuing high-security corporate bonds and needs premium rag paper with embedded anti-counterfeiting features. It's technical enough to sound legitimate, vague enough to avoid obvious red flags. The first 23 mills hang up within minutes. Some laugh and a few threaten to contact authorities. Frank recalibrates. He creates a professional website for Keystone Investments. He registers a callback number in London. He has letterhead printed. Then he starts calling Switzerland. On February 3rd, 2009, a small Swiss company called Artos said yes. Frank can barely contain his voice. He thanks them professionally and promises to send specifications. Then he hangs up and doesn't sleep for 2 days. Over the following weeks, Frank didn't ask for everything at once. That would trigger suspicion. He fed them specifications one component at a time. 75% cotton, 25% linen blend. They could do it. Chemical treatment to defeat iodine detection pens. Unusual but possible. A custom watermark embedded in each sheet. They'd need to see the design. Then came the final request. A polymer security thread woven into the paper, micro-printed with text reading USA 20. Frank claimed it represented the bond denomination. Artos agreed. They quoted 35,000 euros for the custom watermark cylinder, manufactured by a German firm, and shipped to their facility. Frank wired the money through a maze of shell companies without hesitation. He was so close now. One wrong move, and the whole scheme collapsed. One suspicious employee, one compliance officer asking the wrong question, and Frank would be in handcuffs before the paper ever shipped. By September 2009, Artos is ready to produce. Frank orders enough paper to print $250 million, his entire operations output, committed in a single purchase. The invoice comes to $50,000. It's every dollar he's saved and stolen over 15 years. If this shipment arrives safely, he becomes the most prolific counterfeiter in American history. If Customs opens the container, he spends the next 3 decades in prison. The shipment left Switzerland in November 2009, 5 pallets with destination Montreal. What happens when Canadian Customs inspects a container full of currency-grade paper addressed to a man who doesn't exist? And what critical flaw in Frank's operation is already visible to anyone paying attention? A flaw that will eventually bring the Secret Service to his door. December 7th, 2009. Port of Montreal. Frank watches from a parking structure 300 meters away, binoculars shaking in his hands. Somewhere in that maze of stacked metal boxes sits his future. 5 pallets of specialty bond paper packed in unmarked crates, cleared through Customs under a falsified commercial invoice. Customs could inspect any container they wanted. No warrant required, no probable cause. Just random selection, and Frank's entire future was sitting in a metal box labeled specialty paper products, waiting to be examined. If an inspector cut the seal and pulled out a single sheet, they'd feel the texture immediately. They'd hold it to the light and see Andrew Jackson's face staring back at them. Frank would be in handcuffs before sunset. He'd prepared for this. For 3 days, he and 2 associates had conducted counter-surveillance in shifts, memorizing patrol patterns, identifying which inspectors worked which zones, noting how long spot checks typically took. They'd mapped 3 separate escape routes from the port. They'd prepared a cover story in case the container was flagged, a story that wouldn't hold up for 10 minutes under real scrutiny, but might buy enough time to disappear. None of it would matter if an inspector actually opened that box. The container cleared without inspection. Frank didn't celebrate. He didn't even breathe until the truck carrying his paper was 40 kilometers from the port, winding through back roads toward a rented warehouse in Trois-Rivières. Even then, he waited. He left the container untouched for 4 days, driving past the warehouse at irregular intervals, scanning for surveillance teams. Only when he was certain no one was watching did he cut the seal. The paper looked ordinary. Off-white sheets, unprinted, unremarkable. But the moment Frank touched it, he knew. The texture was perfect, grainy, firm, nothing like commercial stock. He held a sheet to the light. Andrew Jackson's face materialized in the fiber, ghostly and precise. A polymer thread ran vertically through the paper. USA 20, repeated in microscopic text. He snapped the sheet between his hands. The sound was identical to real currency. A legitimate paper mill had just manufactured U.S. banknote stock for a private citizen. No one in law enforcement knew it existed. But Frank wasn't done. He had the canvas. Now he needed to paint. And that meant building something that had never existed outside government facilities, a private counterfeiting operation capable of industrial-scale production. This is where most counterfeiters fail. They print a few $1,000s on inkjet printers, pass some bills at gas stations, and get caught within weeks. But Frank wasn't interested in thousands. He wanted hundreds of millions. That required equipment worth more than most people's houses, expertise he didn't possess, and a facility invisible to everyone. Neighbors, police, and even satellite surveillance. The next phase will cost $300,000 in 18 months. It will involve a corrupt ex-printer, organized crime syndicates in 3 countries, and a Heidelberg press so loud Frank's neighbors will assume he's running a sawmill. What modification does Frank make to his counterfeit bills that no other forger has attempted? The detail that will eventually allow $250 million to circulate undetected for years? And which single mistake in his distribution network is already creating the evidence trail that will lead investigators directly to his barn? January 2010. He finds an abandoned barn on a 40-acre farm outside Trois-Rivières. He pays it in cash and registers the property under a fake name. Inside, Frank has constructed a counterfeiting operation sophisticated enough to rival a government mint. The centerpiece was a 4-color Heidelberg offset press, the same type used by legitimate currency printers worldwide. Frank bought it secondhand from a bankrupt print shop for $125,000 cash. It weighed 6 tons. Moving it required a flatbed truck, a rented crane, and 4 men who thought they were relocating equipment for a packaging company. Alongside the Heidelberg, Frank installed industrial dryers, precision cutting machines, UV curing stations, and a custom stamping apparatus for applying color-shifting foil. He sourced specialty inks from suppliers across 3 continents, color-shifting metallics, UV reactive compounds, the exact gray-green formulation used by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. The total investment was just $300,000. He was all in. Every dollar he'd ever made, stolen, or borrowed was now sitting in a barn in rural Quebec. If this worked, he'd print a fortune. If it failed, he'd lose everything and probably his freedom. But Frank still had a problem. He could buy equipment, but he couldn't operate it. Offset printing at this level requires years of training. The color calibration alone takes months to master. One wrong setting and the output looks obviously fake. So Frank did what he always did. He found someone who could be bought. Through underworld connections, he recruited a skilled press operator, a man who'd run a legitimate print shop before serving time for an unrelated crime. This man would become Frank's technical director, teaching him everything about ink density, plate alignment, and the 1,000 small details that separate amateur counterfeits from supernotes. The first test runs were disasters. Colors too saturated. Registration off by fractions of a millimeter. Security features misaligned. Frank burned every failed sheet and started over. For 3 months, he printed nothing but garbage. $300,000 invested, and he couldn't produce a single usable bill. The pressure was crushing. Every day the operation continued was another day someone might notice, a neighbor asking too many questions, a supplier getting suspicious, a random traffic stop that led somewhere it shouldn't. Frank was bleeding money he didn't have, waiting for a breakthrough that might never come. Then, in April 2010, the Heidelberg produced its first perfect $20 bill. Frank held it next to a genuine note. He couldn't tell the difference. Neither could the UV lamp, the iodine pen, or the magnifying loupe he used to check the microprinting. The watermark was flawless. The color-shifting ink transitioned from copper to green at exactly the right angle. The paper snapped correctly. The weight was identical. He ran it through every detection test he could find. It passed them all. By December 2010, Frank has printed 12.5 million counterfeit 20s, $250 million face value. The bills fill 47 wooden crates stacked in a secondary barn on the same property. It's more fake American currency than the Secret Service has seized in any single operation in the agency's 155-year history. But the most important thing in the operation is that Frank didn't spend his counterfeits. He sold them. This is the difference between amateur counterfeiters and professionals. Amateurs pass fake bills one at a time, $20 at a gas station, $50 at a restaurant, and get caught within weeks because cameras, witnesses, and serial number tracking create an evidence trail. Professionals become wholesalers. They sell bulk counterfeit to criminal organizations at a steep discount, let someone else take the distribution risk, and collect clean money in return. Frank's rate, 30 cents on the dollar. For every $1 million in fake 20s, he charged $300,000 in real currency. Given the extraordinary quality of his product, buyers lined up. He sold through a single trusted middleman to organized crime contacts in 3 countries. The rules were strict. No distribution in Canada, nothing in the northeastern United States, and the bills had to enter circulation overseas first, Europe, Asia, anywhere that would delay pattern detection. A fake $20 spent in Prague creates no investigative thread leading back to Quebec. Between 2010 and 2012, Frank moves approximately $50 million in counterfeit currency. His cut, $15 million in legitimate cash, flows into offshore accounts in Panama and the Cayman Islands. He buys nothing flashy. He maintains his same apartment, drives the same truck. The only visible change in his lifestyle is that he stops selling marijuana. Why risk a drug charge when you're sitting on millions? But here's what Frank didn't know. In March 2012, a bank teller in Las Vegas noticed something strange. 11 $20 bills in a single deposit had identical serial numbers. Not Frank's bills. He never duplicated. Someone in his distribution chain had been running their own copies from his originals, and they'd made the one mistake Frank had spent years avoiding. The Secret Service opened a formal investigation. They called it Operation Sunset. Initially, analysts suspected a foreign government operation, North Korea perhaps, or Iran. The quality of the bills was too high for any known criminal enterprise. These weren't basement fakes. They were supernotes, the kind of counterfeits that required state resources to produce. But then, Canadian authorities seized a batch of identical 20s in a drug raid near Montreal. The connection to a known mob associate pointed the investigation north. Quietly, the Secret Service established a joint task force with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They began tracking distribution patterns, flipping low-level couriers, mapping the money's path backward toward its source. By late 2012, they knew a major counterfeiting operation was running somewhere in Quebec. They knew it was producing millions in fake US 20s. They just didn't know exactly where or who was behind it. And one of Frank's 3 wholesale buyers had just been arrested on unrelated charges. The price of his freedom? Delivering the source of the supernotes. How does the Secret Service identify Frank's barn without ever seeing a single piece of physical evidence? And what does Frank possess that will later force the US government to abandon the largest counterfeiting prosecution in American history? May 14th, 2012. A rented bungalow outside Trois-Rivières. Frank arrived carrying a cardboard box containing $1 million in counterfeit 20s, his largest single transaction. The buyer was a man he'd never met, introduced through an intermediary as a representative of an Ontario biker organization with European distribution contacts. The buyer seemed professional, asked the right questions, knew the terminology. But the buyer was an undercover Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer. The bungalow was surrounded by a joint task force that included 3 U.S. Secret Service agents. They'd been building this case for 4 months. Frank enters the bungalow. Belleau greets him, examines the merchandise, and asks about pricing. Frank quotes his standard rate, $300,000 for the million. Belleau nods, reaches for his phone as if to authorize a wire transfer, and speaks a single word, confirmed. The front and back doors explode simultaneously. Flashbang grenades detonate in the kitchen and hallway. Officers in tactical gear pour through every entrance, shouting commands in French and English. Frank is on the ground before he processes what's happening, face pressed into carpet, wrists zip-tied behind his back, the weight of 2 officers pinning his shoulders. 40 minutes later, a second team raids the barn. They find the Heidelberg still warm from a production run completed that morning. They find cutting equipment, ink barrels, and printing plates. They find approximately $1 million in finished counterfeit currency and another $2 million in uncut sheets. What they don't find is the other $200 million. At RCMP headquarters, the interrogation was brutal. Canadian charges alone carried up to 14 years. But the Americans wanted him more. Under U.S. federal law, the scale of Frank's operation triggered sentencing guidelines pushing towards 60 years. A Secret Service agent mentioned ADX Florence, the Supermax facility where inmates spend 23 hours daily in solitary confinement. Frank asks for a lawyer. Then he stops talking entirely. For 18 months, Frank sits in a Montreal detention facility while prosecutors assemble their case and the U.S. files extradition paperwork. His public defender advises him to plead guilty and hope for a reduced sentence. But Frank refuses. He's calculating something no one else understands. The Secret Service has seized his equipment. They've dismantled his distribution network. They've arrested 14 associates across 3 countries, but they've recovered less than 2% of his total output. The remaining 98%, over $200 million in supernotes, is hidden in a location only Frank knows. And as long as those bills exist, they represent an ongoing threat to the integrity of the US dollar Think about it from Washington's perspective. $200 million in super notes, bills so perfect, the Federal Reserve can't distinguish them without laboratory analysis, sitting in an unknown location. If Frank went to prison, that money would eventually surface. His associates would sell it. It would flood currency markets worldwide. The damage to confidence in the dollar would be catastrophic. Frank understands this. More importantly, he understands that the Secret Service understands this. In his cell, he drafts a proposal. He will reveal the location of every remaining counterfeit note and surrender his backup printing plates. In exchange, the charges against him will be reduced to a single count of minor counterfeiting. His sentence will be limited to time served. The U.S. will withdraw its extradition request, and he will walk free. His lawyer reads the proposal and tells Frank he's delusional. The government doesn't negotiate with counterfeiters. Frank smiles and says, the government has never dealt with a counterfeiter who can threaten their currency supply from inside a prison cell. What happens when Frank's proposal reaches the U.S. Attorney's office in Washington? And what does Frank do in the weeks before the scheduled handover to ensure law enforcement can't simply seize the money and revoke the deal? December 3rd, 2013. A conference room in Montreal's Palais de Justice. Frank sits across from 4 attorneys, 2 Canadian prosecutors, 1 U.S. assistant attorney, and his own public defender. The extradition hearing is scheduled for the following week. Frank's lawyer has just presented his client's offer. The room is silent for 11 seconds. Then the U.S. attorney laughs. He calls the proposal absurd. He reminds everyone that counterfeiting is a federal crime with mandatory sentencing guidelines, that negotiating with criminals establishes dangerous precedent, that the United States does not capitulate to blackmail. Frank interrupts. He explains calmly that $200 million in undetectable counterfeit currency currently sits in a location known only to him. If he's extradited, that money stays hidden. His accomplices, none of whom know the location, will eventually retrieve it and sell it at a discount to the highest bidder. Within 18 months, those supernotes will flood currency markets in Asia, Europe, and the Americas. The damage to confidence in the dollar will far exceed whatever satisfaction the government derives from imprisoning him. Suddenly, the U.S. attorney stops laughing. Negotiations continue for 6 weeks. Frank's lawyer later describes the process as surreal. Federal agents arguing about the acceptable number of years a counterfeiter should serve, while that same counterfeiter holds the integrity of their currency hostage. By January 2014, a deal emerges. Frank will plead guilty to a single count under Canadian law. His sentence? Time served, totaling 6 weeks from his initial arrest. He will pay a fine of $1,300. The United States will formally withdraw its extradition request. In exchange, Frank will surrender the complete $200 million in counterfeit currency, his backup printing plates, and a secondary Heidelberg press he'd kept in reserve. The handover is scheduled for January 31st, 2014. In the 4 weeks between the agreement and the transfer date, RCMP surveillance teams follow Frank constantly, hoping he'll lead them to the stash and void the deal. Frank anticipated this. Before revealing his proposal, he'd already arranged for an associate to relocate the counterfeit currency to a secure location. The associate, who has no criminal record and no connection to the case, rented a storage unit under a false name, loaded 10 large boxes into a commercial box truck, and parked it behind an abandoned motel off Highway 40. Frank never visits the site. He never even glances in its direction. He waits. On the morning of January 31st, a convoy of unmarked vehicles escorts Frank, now legally a free man under the signed agreement, to the motel parking lot. Frank directs them to a rusted box truck in the corner. An RCMP sergeant hands him bolt cutters. Frank snaps the padlock and swings open the doors. The agents stare in silence. Floor to ceiling, the truck contains cardboard boxes packed with shrink-wrapped bundles of $20 bills. One investigator climbs inside and slices open a box at random. He examines a note under portable UV light. The security thread fluoresces correctly. The watermark is perfect. The color-shifting ink transitions from copper to green at the proper angle. These are Frank's supernotes, the largest single seizure of counterfeit American currency in history. It takes 4 hours and 3 additional trucks to transport the money to a secure RCMP facility for cataloging and destruction. Frank watches from beside his lawyer's sedan, arms crossed, a faint smile visible in photographs taken by a journalist who'd received an anonymous tip about the location. 2 months later, Frank Barraza pays his $1,300 fine in cash, real cash, and walks out of a Montreal courthouse. Reporters ask if he has any regrets. Frank shrugs. He tells them he's already consulting with security firms on anti-counterfeiting measures. The man who printed $250 million now advises governments on how to stop people like himself. The Secret Service agents who spent 3 years building the case against him refuse to comment publicly. Internally, Frank's name becomes shorthand for a specific kind of failure, the criminal too sophisticated to prosecute, too brazen to ignore, too dangerous to let operate, and too valuable to imprison. Frank still lives in Quebec. He's never been charged with another crime. The super notes he printed continued circulating for years after his arrest. Some estimates suggest $50 million in face value remains unrecovered, passing through economies worldwide without detection. The U.S. Treasury has since redesigned the $20 bill twice, adding features specifically intended to prevent another Frank Barraza. Whether those measures would stop him is a question no one in Washington wants to answer. If you think Frank's escape was audacious, consider the North Korean operation that printed $100 million in perfect American hundreds using equipment stolen from the U.S. government itself, a story that makes Frank look like an amateur.